We are online, and you have the earphones.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We have held the first stage of our talks, and we focused, of course, on relations between Russia and the UK. These relations leave much to be desired. They are at the lowest point over the past few years, and this is not our fault. I will not dwell on that, but I would like to say that Russia stands for normalizing Russia-UK relations, improving those relations, and returning them to normal and business-like kind of partnership. And of course, that's only possible based on the principles of mutual respect, respect for each other's legitimate interests, equal rights, whereas ultimatums, threats, and imposing one's own conditions on your partner is a path that will lead nowhere. This has to be a two-way street after all. I'd like to say that if we act based on our national interests, based on the need for both sides to have value added from their contacts, then our trade turnover is a good example. In November and December last year, we saw that it has been the same as in 2020, over $20 million, and Russia and the UK continue to cooperate in practical matters, finding ways to find new ways to invest in each other's economies. We are supporting our business circles, and this would be helpful. Another thing that would be helpful is to restart the dialogue between our commissions on economic development, economic cooperation, and nuclear cooperation. Another good dynamics example is shown by our cultural cooperation. In 2019 and 2020, we've had successful cross-cultural years of music in Russia and the UK, and for the years of 2022-2023, we are planning to hold years of knowledge. And of course, we do support links between the civil society communities of our two countries. We haven't discussed that in detail yet. I hope that we will be able to discuss that later. Why we haven't discussed that is because Ms. Truss has asked us from the very start, and in fact, she has expressed her desire to discuss Belarus, China, Iran, Ukraine, and we have focused on, of course, on the implementation of the Minsk protocols, which are ignored by Kiev, by the Kiev regime. We have talked about steps that Russia is taking to try to have those that have sway over the Kiev regime to make Ukraine actually carry out its agreements that it has signed up to. Unfortunately, various sides have different interpretations of the Minsk protocols. I do not see how they could be interpreted differently, because it is written black on white on paper. We have also discussed about Russia's relations with Belarus. We have touched upon the upcoming military exercises that will start in just a few days. They have been causing some concern in London and in the West in general, as well as the matter of Russian troops moved across Russian territory, which has, for some reason, has stirred a lot of hysteria in the West, including our British colleagues. colleagues, UK colleagues, we have also covered our relations with China and the latest talks that President Putin had with Chairman Xi. We have talked about the way Russia builds its ties with China bilaterally and across various international organizations. And all of our relations have been based on mutual respect, on a balance of interests, on equal rights, without an approach that's based on a logic of someone leading and someone following, a logic that we have seen a lot within NATO. And speaking of that, we have an opinion that there are chances within the upcoming weeks to restart the joint comprehensive plan of actions, that's as for Iran, and in the context of the Ukrainian matter, Ms. Truss has touched upon the issue of the initiative of the Russian Federation proposed mid-December last year that have to do with ensuring guarantees of security in Europe. Russia has talked in detail about our approach to working with the United States overall, and we have expressed our interest in having a specific reaction from the West, not just some words, but a specific reaction to our call to interpret the response that we've received at the highest level of the OSCE, and our calls to not improve one's security at the expense of any other party's security. This is the problem that has been touched by President Putin during his talks with French President Emmanuel Macron. Mr. Putin believes that expanding NATO would go against everything that we and our partners stand for, and he called for ways to look for other options to improve the security of both European countries, the Ukraine, and of course the Russian Federation. I cannot say that we have specific points of contact right now, but I have to say that today's talks helped our British counterparts to understand how important all of these matters are to Russia. And I hope that during the working lunch that we'll be able to discuss many other matters, including Russia's cooperation, Russia's role within the UN, Russia's permanent membership role within the UN, since Russia has this special responsibility for upholding security and stability in the world. And I hope that in the future, when we talk about international matters, we will make a specific focus on these issues, not on trying to find artificially hyped up problems that only thwart dialogue and prevent us from addressing various problems for the sake of peace and stability on the planet. Thank you.
Good morning. Minister Lavrov and I have discussed some very serious issues today that have a bearing on the future peace and stability of Europe. As I have said, there is still time for Russia to end its aggression towards Ukraine and pursue the path of diplomacy. But NATO is very clear. If that path is not chosen, there will be severe consequences for Russia, Ukraine, and the whole of Europe. Russia is a country with a rich and deep history. It has extraordinary prowess in fields like science and mathematics. There could be huge opportunities ahead for the people of Russia. However, the aggression by the Russian government and attempts to relitigate the past are seriously undermining Russia's international standing. In particular, the claim that the indivisibility of security means that countries on Russia's borders can't defend themselves or join defensive alliances like NATO simply isn't true. Russia's actions in attempting to destabilize Ukrainian democracy and the ability of Ukrainians to determine their own future, including through hybrid warfare and amassing over 100,000 troops on the border in a threatening manner. These acts have actually had the effect of strengthening NATO's resolve and turning the Ukrainian people further away from Russia. There are also serious implications for energy supplies at a time of rising gas prices. We believe fundamentally in the self-determination of the Ukrainian people. If there were to be a Russia incursion into Ukraine, the Ukrainians will fight. This would be a prolonged and drawn-out conflict. The UK and our allies would put in place severe sanctions targeting individuals and institutions. And the United States have been clear that Nord Stream 2 would not go ahead. But today I'm here to talk about the alternative path that Russia can take. As a fellow permanent member of the Security Council, Russia can stick by its commitments to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity as agreed in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. Russia can work through the NATO-Russia Council to improve trust and transparency on issues like forced posture, and NATO have put forward positive proposals which we want to discuss with Russia. And also, we can work together with other P5 nations to stop Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon, which Minister Lavrov and I also discussed. Russia has a choice which can result in a better future for Europe, Russia, and the Russian people. Thank you.
Colleagues, we will now proceed to the Q&A session. I'll now give the floor to the British media.
Steve Rosenberg of the BBC first, please.
Thank you very much. Foreign Secretary, first a question for you. A few days ago, you posted on social media this. You said about Ukraine, Russia's actions show their claims to have no plans to invade are false. After today's talks, do you still believe that Russia has plans for a further invasion of Ukraine? And a question for Foreign Minister Lavrov. We're increasingly hearing the phrase coercive diplomacy to describe Russia's actions now, this combination of political demands and muscle flexing. Do you believe that coercive diplomacy is working for you? And is this what we can expect from now on? Is this how Russia will be conducting its foreign policy from now on? Thank you.
Well, Steve, the facts speak for themselves. We have seen the amassing of troops and weapons on the Ukrainian border by Russia in a threatening matter. And we've also seen the establishment of cyber warfare and other forms of hybrid warfare to seek to undermine Ukrainian democracy. But why I'm here in Moscow today is that Russia has a very clear choice. They can pursue the path of diplomacy, work with NATO to improve European security, or continue down the path that they have been indicating by amassing troops on the border in a threatening way.
Я теперь, да?
Can I answer my part of the
Ну,
question?
знаете, мы сегодня подробно об этом говорили.
We have
Я, честно говоря,
spoken in detail about that
разочарован
today.
тем, что
I'm
разговор
truly disappointed
немого с
that
глухим у нас получается.
this is like the deaf
Вроде
talking
бы слушаем, но не слышим.
to the blind,
По крайней
etc.
мере,
Or
наши
basically
подробнейшие
nobody's hearing
разъяснения,
each other.
в общем-то, упали на такую неподготовленную почву.
Unfortunately,
примерно так
our
же, как
attempts to
говорят, что
explain
Россия ждет,
ourselves
когда замерзнет
have
земля
fallen on
и
deaf
станет как
ears.
камень, чтобы танки
Someone
спокойно
is
прошли
saying that
на
Russia is
украинскую
waiting
территорию. Вот, мне
for
кажется,
the
такая же почва
ground
сегодня
to
была у
freeze
наших
so that Russian
британских
tanks in
коллег,
Ukraine
на
could
которую
move
ложились,
forward.
от
And
которой
I think this
отскакивали
is the frozen ground
факты,
that we have faced today
многочисленные факты,
in
которые мы
our
сегодня приводили,
UK counterparts, we have provided lots of facts, a lot of explanations of details, including those provided by President Putin and other representatives of Russia, but they have all fallen on deaf ears. Either our counterparts are not aware of any of these facts, or they are deliberately ignoring them. You have just quoted Ms. Truss, that the claims that Russia has no plans to invade Ukraine are false, but this is not just the Russian government that's making these statements, it's also the Pentagon that's making these statements that Russia has no plans for an invasion. I have just read them. There are serious people in the Pentagon. They are using satellites to look at the Russian territory and see what's going on. And the same statement was made by the defense minister of Ukraine, by the Ukrainian president even. He called on the nation not to panic. But it seems like our Western counterparts want to have an instrument to unbalance Russia and the situation overall, regardless of whatever negative consequences this hysteria might have for Ukraine as well. We're seeing investors fleeing Ukraine. We see capital leaving Ukraine. We see diplomatic personnel being evacuated from Ukraine, from Kiev. They're calling on people to leave the country as soon as possible. Now we're thinking maybe it's the UK that's planning something, or the US planning something, that they are trying to evacuate their diplomatic personnel now. We do not advise our diplomatic staff to leave their posts. I don't know what our Anglo-Saxon counterparts want to do, what they intend to do, and today we've spent a lot of time trying to explain to Ms. Truss what our troops are doing on our own territory that is so concerning to the West. There are hundreds of thousands of troops, or foreign troops, in the Baltic states. Recently we've heard Boris Johnson that the troops should also be sent to Romania and Bulgaria. So these are territories of other countries. But for Russian troops, they are based on Russian territory. So this kind of line we've heard throughout the entire conversation. I'd like to know why our colleagues are so indoctrinated when they approach the issues of security on the European continent. How selfish or how NATO-centric everything is when it comes to addressing Russia's legitimate concerns about its own security, and how they only talk about parts of their responsibility for respecting the principle of indivisibility and collective security, and disregard the other parts of the agreements they've signed, because it is stipulated under those documents that no state can improve or enhance its security at the expense of the security of a different state. Neutrality is paramount, and there can be no situation within the OSCE when one country dominates, or a group of countries dominates, or an organization dominates, and there also a stipulation against any kinds of spheres of influence within the OSCE sphere. We have provided examples of these spheres of influence being set up deliberately, intentionally by NATO, by the EU, for example, in the Balkans, when they say that Russians have no place there, like they have no place in Africa, for example, or they have a special ambassador who is tasked in Bosnia and Herzegovina to influence legislation that has to do with language there. Isn't that specific ways to influence law there when it comes to the Russian language. And of course, we've addressed the questions asked by Ms. Truss when it comes to Belarus, when it comes to Russian plans for its partnership with Belarus. It all looks like a one-sided approach that is rooted in a view by the West that it has the ultimate right to demand all kinds of guarantees from Russia, whereas Russia is not giving any guarantees in return. This one-sided dialogue, this one-sided discussion is repeated and will probably be repeated in the responses that we are waiting for from the West when it comes to our concerns on the principles of indivisibility and security. And from what I've heard, instead of having specific responses from each of the OSCE member states, the European Union wants to make a unified document where there will be no nuance, no details by every specific member of the EU or of the OSCE. Once that happens, we will try to find ways out of that and diplomatic impasse. As for what you've said, that Russia is trying to combine a coercive diplomacy with some kind of physical threats and diplomacy, if I understood you correctly, Russia has no desire to coerce anyone into anything. It is the West that are saying that the demand to carry out the decisions of the OSCE summits stands for coercing someone. That's not coercion. Our Western partners have all started using the term de-escalation, one after the other. Whatever Russia is doing, we are just demanding that it de-escalate its actions, and that Russia chooses diplomacy. That's what they have been saying for the past few weeks. We have stood for diplomacy for many years, for all these years, and we will continue to do so. The Istanbul Charter of 1999 and the Astana Declaration signed in 2010 are all products of diplomacy, of the highest level of diplomacy, diplomacy at the highest level. Now they're saying that we have the statement that no one can improve its security at the expense of someone else, but that Russia, they're saying that Russia is doing that way just so that any country can have alliances. Well, we have been sort of cheated. Russia has been cheated and wronged for many years and many times when it comes to various agreements and obligations by other states. We have welcomed many agreements within the OSCE when it comes to the indivisibility of security. For example, there is a package that has been agreed upon, and only the issue of alliances is taken out of it, is focused on, while the security issue is being ignored, deliberately ignored, as the same as the West approach when it comes to the Minsk protocols. And when it comes to Kyiv's inability or unwillingness to honor their agreements, the amnesty issue, the special status of the Donbass, the reforms, the cooperation with Donetsk and Lugansk, the holding of elections under the aegis of the OSCE in Donetsk and Lugansk. None of that has been honored. Out of all of this package, they're only taking the last part. And when I talked about that with Ms. Truss today, she said, well, we need to look at the consistency of steps made by Kyiv, because Kyiv is taking a specific stipulation of the Minsk protocols, which is restoring control of the borders, but it is undergirdled by all of the other stipulations that I've just outlined. It's impossible to carry it out without all of the other parts of the Minsk protocols. And the same goes for the OSCE. agreements, you cannot just focus on one thing, on one part of the document, and disregard everything else, all of the other words in this document. We're not trying to coerce or threaten anyone. Look at our public statements. There haven't been a single threat. It is Russia that's being threatened, including by Ms. Truss speaking in the House of Commons recently, and she said this today again. During our talks, we've heard the same rhetoric we've heard online, we've heard from the various MPs in the UK Parliament saying about Russian aggression. What aggression? When did it start? What are you talking about? They're talking about ramifications, about Russia will have hell to pay, etc. Have you ever heard Russians say that? Or Russian officials make such kinds of threats? No. Let me emphasize that again. The spirit of compromise, the spirit of the search for respect for mutual interests, for legitimate interests of each country, that was at the foundation of the OSCE documents. This spirit of mutual respect and equality, it is something that should help us take these agreements, take these documents that we've signed and make them a reality. Now is the time where words cannot remain words. This is not the kind of cooperation we want.
Пожалуйста, РИА Новости.
РИА Новости.
Да, здравствуйте. У меня вопрос о главе МИД Британии. Два вопроса. Первый, недавно...
Actually, one of our colleagues hasn't turned off his mic. Could you do that, please?
Алло.
Excuse me.
Да, еще раз. Недавно в публичном доступе появились документы Foreign Office, программы под условным названием «Подрыв влияния России». Речь идет о финансировании российских СМИ и НПО через британские ведомства и структуры BBC. Вот можете ли вы подтвердить подлинность документов этого проекта? Это первый вопрос. Если позволите, второй вопрос. Британия заявляет о наращивании российских войск у украинской границы, хотя они находятся на территории России. При этом британские военные корабли заходят в российские территориальные воды в Черном море. Вот не считаете ли вы подобные действия Лондона агрессивными?
Do you not think that these are aggressive actions by the UK as well?
There is no doubt that the stationing of over 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border is directly put in place to threaten Ukraine. And this is not the only action that we've seen by the Russian authorities. We've seen cyber attacks and we've seen other attempts to undermine the activities of a sovereign nation, despite the fact that Russia signed up to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which agreed to protect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. And can I remind you that in the UN purposes and principles, it is very clear that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force. And I can't see any other reason for having 100,000 troops stationed on the Ukrainian border apart from to threaten Ukraine. And if Russia is serious about diplomacy, they need to move those troops and desist from the threats. Now, if we are able to follow a path of diplomacy, and NATO has put offer on the table for talks to improve transparency, to improve confidence between the parties, then there are hopes of a better future. And what the British Embassy is doing here in Moscow is pursuing closer ties in areas like science, mathematics, and culture. But those closer ties will only result from a better relationship between the United Kingdom and Russia. And I also want to respond to Minister Lavrov's point about indivisible security and the issues that were raised in the OSCE agreements. What it says is that there should be no undermining of another country's security. No one is undermining Russia's security. That is simply not true. And it is perfectly proper for sovereign nations such as Ukraine to defend themselves and to seek defensive alliances. That is part of protecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. And on the subject of the Minsk agreements, Russia needs to fully implement the ceasefire, and it needs to remove the heavy weaponry from the region. That has to happen so that we can make progress on the Minsk agreements. Now, I think there is progress to be made. I think there is progress to be made between NATO and Russia on transparency, on discussions around security, and I think there is progress to be made on the Minsk agreements too. But Russia needs to properly engage, and they do need to de-escalate and move the troops away from the border.
Можно еще раз звук включить?
Can you switch on the sound?
Да, пожалуйста, РИА Новости.
Yes, RIA
Да,
Novosti.
простите, просто вы не ответили
Excuse me, but you
на
haven't
вопросы
answered
по
my
поводу кораблей.
second question about
И можете ли вы подтвердить
British
подлинность документов
military
проекта?
vessels, and you never said anything about the documents that I talked about that were published
In
online.
response to Russia's actions and the threatening behaviour of Russia on the Ukrainian border, the United Kingdom is working with our NATO allies to make sure we are strengthening defence. This is purely defensive. NATO is a defensive alliance, and that is absolutely the right approach to take. But it would be better if Russia were to de-escalate and these responses weren't necessary. But we have to make sure that we are working with our NATO allies and we are standing by our security agreements. I've already responded on your points about the documents. Our embassy works in good faith with institutions across Russia to strengthen our relationship in areas from culture to mathematics to science. And that's what we want to do. But it is proving very difficult in an environment where Russia is actively threatening a sovereign nation.
Diana Mag News, if I can. Foreign Secretary, the Foreign Minister just characterised these talks as...
Should you announce?
They don't
Who is
introduce
that?
themselves? No. But we have
Very
to
sorry.
know.
Could we come to Tom Parfitt of The Times, please?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. A question first for Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, please. President Macron of France said this week that President Putin had committed to not launch any new military initiatives regarding Ukraine, and French officials indicated that there were signs that Russia was moving towards some kind of de-escalation. Have you received any kind of similar assurance? Do you see any evidence at all of some kind of Russian de-escalation, or have some of your European colleagues got the wrong end of the stick? And if I may as well, a question for Minister Lavrov. Minister Lavrov, were there any concessions or assurances that you received from Foreign Secretary Truss today regarding Russia's central concern over NATO enlargement? Thank you.
Minister Lavrov has said to me today that Russia have no plans to invade Ukraine. But we need to see those words followed up by actions, and we need to see the troops and the equipment that is stationed on the Ukrainian border moved elsewhere, because at present it is in a very threatening posture. And whilst I want to work towards a better outcome, it's vitally important that the UK and its NATO allies are prepared for all eventualities. That is why we are providing defensive support to Ukraine. It's why we're working to strengthen support across NATO. And it's why we have put in place a much tougher legislation on sanctions, so we are ready in the event of an incursion. Now, my purpose here in Moscow today is absolutely to avoid that outcome and to work with Russia to make sure that we move ahead on talks with NATO. But that cannot come at the expense of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And it can't come at the expense of NATO's open door policy.
Ну, я могу подтвердить, что именно это госпожа министр и говорила. Все те 2 часа, которые мы провели за закрытыми дверями, никакой другой интонации мы не слышали. Требование убрать российские войска с российской территории, оно никоим образом не менялось в ответ на наши аргументы. И это вызывает, конечно, сожаление, как минимум. И когда вы ссылаетесь на то, что президент Макрон подтвердил, что президент Путин сказал ему об отсутствии каких-либо планов куда-либо вторгаться, и госпожа министр комментирует это требованием, чтобы слова не расходились с делами. В общем, это интересный такой разговор. Я давно не участвовал в дипломатических переговорах, которые можно было, в общем-то, вести в прямом эфире, по большому счету. Потому что ничего секретного, ничего какого-то конфиденциального, доверительного, кроме того, что звучит с высоких трибун регулярно в Лондоне, мы, в общем, не услышали. Но насчет слов и дел, мы всегда за то, чтобы слова не расходились, вернее, чтобы дела не расходились со словами. И в этом смысле привлекаю внимание к многочисленным, подробнейшим материалам, которые использовались в интервью президента Путина, в интервью руководству нашего министерства, которые распространялись по всему свету, которые подтверждают, что нам очень активно и убедительно обещали не расширять НАТО на восток, чтобы потом осуществить 5 волн расширения, и когда НАТО уже, будучи оборонительным альянсом, как сейчас госпожа Мисс подтвердила, подошел вплотную к нашим границам. Оборонительный альянс был понятен, когда существовал Варшавский договор, когда была и физическая, и воображаемая более широкая Берлинская стена, это была линия обороны, и все это понимали. Сейчас нет ни Варшавского договора, ни Берлинской стены. А НАТО каждый раз сама определяет, где будет проходить та линия, на которой она будет выполнять свои оборонительные функции. Я вот сегодня упоминал о том, что Йенс Столтенберг уже многократно заявлял, что НАТО должна нести особую ответственность за обеспечение безопасности в Индо-Тихоокеанском регионе, в частности, в Южно-Китайском море. Если НАТО назначит себе еще и эту линию обороны, вы тоже будете настаивать на том, что это право всех стран двигаться туда, куда захочет НАТО. Это опасная игра. И вот эти все заклинания про оборонительный характер Североатлантического альянса, мы их слышим, несмотря на то, что многократно предъявляли нашим нацистским коллегам информацию о том, как они бомбили Югославию, как они бомбили Ирак на основе повода, который потом Тони Блэр назвал ошибкой и в общем-то, фейк. Много есть примеров, как оборонительный альянс работает. Ну и упреки в наш адрес, которые выдвигают Лондон и другие западные столицы, которые касаются того, что мы вмешиваемся повсюду, и какая-то там вот кибервойна в очередной раз прозвучала. Есть спекуляции, причем в каких-то вроде бы даже уважаемых средствах массовой информации, об операции, которую мы готовим с целью захватить Киев.
serious media outlets, they're talking about an operation that's Russia planning to assault and capture various Ukrainian cities. This is all going back to the highly likely story that I very like so much. Because everything that they're saying, all the allegations are all followed by the words of it's highly likely. But there are no arguments, no actual no facts, nothing to show for it. And the same goes for Skripal. There's no evidence, no facts, no evidence when it comes to Alexei Navalny and the campaign against Russia that was followed by the incident with Navalny. We have been talking about that today, and like I've always said, our cooperation, our partnership should be based on facts. Otherwise, it's hollow, and we haven't heard any facts. If you make allegations, you need to corroborate them, you need to present at least some evidence, and we have seen none. Ms. Truss also mentioned the Budapest Memorandum. She has done it twice today in this hall, despite the detailed explanations that we have provided on that matter today. The Budapest Memorandum between Russia and the UK and the US guaranteed, or rather provided guarantees of security to Ukraine as a non-nuclear state. These are standard guarantees that are provided to any non-nuclear state. The Budapest Memorandum does not oblige Russia or the UK or the US to acknowledge or to accept the coup that was carried out by neo-Nazis and various other marginal groups in Ukraine back in 2014. And this Budapest Memorandum that was also signed by Ukraine and France, in addition to the members I've mentioned, it calls on, it demands that all members of this memorandum do not violate any of the OSCE principles, including the principle for respecting and protecting minorities, national minorities and ethnic minorities. Nobody is going to impose on us the need to acknowledge an unconstitutional regime, to go against all that agreements we have signed, and then say that the actions perpetrated by this regime against minorities, including Russian minorities, is justifiable. And this is all done with active support of the Ukrainian government and President Zelensky himself. And since we're talking about Ukraine, I have just reminded Ms. Truss that President Zelensky and his ministers and his head of defense also said publicly that they will not, that they are not going to honor the Minsk agreements, that there are going to be no direct dialogue with Lugansk or Donetsk, because it is not stipulated under the Minsk agreements, he said. Well, this is right from the Goebbels textbook, or maybe even worse than that, maybe even more talented than that, because to say outright lies for everyone to see when it's written in the document, word by word, and to not care that London or Washington are going to say, what are you saying? This is a uniquely comfortable position for any demagogue that's trying to say that he is correct or he is right and trying to rewrite the Minsk agreements. Unfortunately, we haven't heard any response to that from our partners today. I think that's it. Or is there any other issue that you wanted me to address?
I'd like to ask a question, if I may.
Извините, ради бога, пожалуйста, это Sky News. Следующий, пожалуйста, российские журналисты, телеканал Russia Today, Sky News, мы обязательно дадим слово.
Russia Today journalists having the floor.
Thank you.
Мурат Газдиев, РТ. Если можно, я задам вопрос два вопроса на английском языке. Foreign Secretary, two questions for you, if I may. You You recently brought up Chechnya in the context of what is happening in Ukraine. You said you remember well events back then. And the question is, Britain extended extraordinary support to Chechen separatists back then. We all remember Margaret Thatcher hosting dinner for Aslan Maskhadov, who was the then president of Chechnya. You had him and his subordinates following that then launch a series of horrendous atrocities, acts of terror across Russia, hundreds dead, the theater siege, you may remember, after which the United States cut him off, saying he had lost all legitimacy. And the question is, why did Britain extend such support for Chechen separatists back then, despite the knowledge that there were thousands of Arab, foreign, Ukrainian, Georgian fighters with the Chechens? And why has Britain shown none of that engagement with separatists and rebels in eastern Ukraine? And my second question is, if I may, several years back, your boss, Boris Johnson, said that engaging with Russia diplomatically, and he mentioned Serguéi Lavrov and President Putin by name, that engaging with them diplomatically was a fool's errand. Has the Prime Minister changed his mind? And are you here on what he would call a fool's errand?
The point I was making about both Chechnya and Afghanistan is the cost of war, which is immense for all sides. The point I'm making to the Russian government is that the Ukrainians will fight. And this would be a very protracted, prolonged conflict. We owe it to our populations, we owe it to European security to do all we can to avert a war in Ukraine. And that is why I'm here, to work with the Russian government, to work with our NATO allies. Russia and the United Kingdom are both permanent members of the Security Council. I believe there is a better way, and that is what I am here to seek. And the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is very much behind those efforts.
Если у Раш туда и больше нет вопросов, тогда мы переходим...
Если можно, я бы все-таки хотел спросить. Так поменял Борис Джонсон свое мнение? Has Boris Johnson changed his mind about diplomatic engagement with Russia? And why hasn't Britain tried to engage the rebels and separatists in eastern Ukraine directly? Why haven't they been invited for talks in London as Chechen separatists were?
The Prime Minister is 100% behind us pursuing a diplomatic solution with our allies in NATO and others, and that's why I'm here in Moscow today, to make as much progress as we can and to work to take those discussions forward. I've been very clear about that. And, I'm not going to go into the wheres and wherefores of what's happened in the past. The situation we're in at the present is that the Minsk agreements have been agreed, but they haven't been implemented. And the first step has to be implementing the ceasefire and Russia removing its heavy weaponry from the region. That is the way we will make progress.
Highly likely.
Could we come to Diana Magnay of Sky News, please?
Thank you. First, for the Foreign Secretary, Foreign Minister Lavrov seemed to characterize your conversation just now as similar to being, if I understand it right, between a deaf and a mute. I wonder what your response to that would be. And also, you said that you were looking and hoping to encourage Russia along the path of a meaningful conversation on European security. Did you get any hint that Russia was prepared to engage on particular issues which might be meaningful? And a question for you, Foreign Minister Lavrov. This is clearly an exceptionally tense situation between nations. and de-escalation would help take the heat out of the situation. It is pretty normal to return troops to their bases after, for example, the exercises in Belarus. But are you prepared to make any meaningful gestures to de-escalate and take some of the heat out of this conversation? Out of this situation?
Well, first of all, I certainly wasn't mute in our discussions earlier. I put forward the UK's point of view on the current situation and the fact that, as well as seeking to deter Russia from an invasion into Ukraine, we are also very resolute in pursuing the diplomatic path. And I listened to what Foreign Minister Lavrov has to say. I think there are further talks to be had. NATO has put proposals on the table to improve transparency, to improve confidence, and I want us to take those talks forward.
Что касается тезиса о том, что после военных учений войска возвращаются в казармы, так оно и бывает обычно. Что касается продолжительности учений, это суверенное право каждого соответствующего правительства. Но в отличие от учений на своей территории, которые Россия проводит, после которых войска возвращаются в казармы, те войска, которые далеко за пределами территории и Великобритании, и Соединенных Штатов, и Канады направляются в страны Балтии, в страны, которые находятся на берегу Черного моря. Вот эти войска и вооружения, как правило, никогда не возвращаются домой. Мы об этом тоже сегодня говорили, но госпожа министр, в общем-то, достаточно доходчиво объяснила, что это нас не касается. А вот российские войска на российской территории – это главная озабоченность Лондона, и лозунг деэскалации, который вы сейчас очень грамотно повторили, он является объединяющим фактором для всего западного сообщества. И вы в той же логике, которую вам политические элиты Запада уже не один месяц втолковывают, вы задали свой вопрос, готова ли Россия какой-то значимый жест осуществить, предпринять какой-то значимый жест, чтобы ситуацию разрядить? Вы мне должны сначала доказать, что мы эту ситуацию зарядили, что мы ее нагнетаем, и что мы делаем что-то, что не касается нашего суверенитета и нашего суверенного права действовать на своей собственной территории. Я оставляю на совести наших западных партнеров утверждение относительно присутствия российских войск, тяжелых вооружений на Украине. Это все из разряда highly likely. Я приводил примеры Литвиненко, Скрипали, Навальный. Такие же обвинения. Ни разу не то, что нам не предъявили факты, а когда мы уже несколько раз подряд напоминаем о том, что этих фактов нет. Просто все эти замечания пропускаются мимо ушей. Нас не хотят слышать. Потому что, видимо, мы имеем иные права, не столь значимые права на международной арене, как считает Великобритания, какими правами она обладает. Вот вы сказали, учения в Беларуси тоже проходят учения. Госпожа министр заявила, что главное избежать войны на Украине, и вот зачем я здесь. Я предвижу вполне развязку вот всей этой драмы, которую Запад разыгрывает, пытается из нее даже трагедию сделать, хотя все больше похоже на комедию. Следующее. Вот через какое-то время западные страны узнают, что закончились российско-белорусские учения, и войска российские вернулись на российскую территорию. И тогда будет поднят большой шум для того, чтобы доказать, что вот Запад добился от России деэскалации. Хотя на самом деле это будет торговля воздухом. Конечно, все знают прекрасно, об этом было заявлено, что после завершения учений российские войска всегда возвращаются на свою территорию.
Russia's troops always return to bases after any military exercises. Actually, I've read in one of the Canadian media outlets that the matter of Ukraine, there was this Canadian reporter who said that Ukraine is a crutch that the Western politicians use to retain their standing, so to speak, their ratings. And I think when it comes to the security issues of any country, whether it's NATO or Ukraine or EU or Russia, I sincerely hope that we can all act as adults and not engage in propaganda to try and achieve some electoral outcomes. And now for the final question. Channel 1 Russia. I have a question to Ms. Truss. You recently have spoken while in Australia that Ukraine has been invaded even by the Mongols and the Tatars and many other nations. But was there any other nation that became stronger as a result of the invasion of Mongols and Tatars? And maybe there was any other nation you would like to mention?
The point I was making is that if there were to be an incursion into Ukraine, then that would not be a rapid resolution. What we would see is a prolonged conflict, which I think would be very damaging for obviously the people of Ukraine, but also the people of Russia and for European security. So at all costs, we must make sure that we avoid that, whilst but obviously maintaining the fact that Ukraine is a sovereign country that makes its own decisions about whether it joins NATO or not, and that also maintains its territorial integrity.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Okay.
Tonight, that's all.